The hegemony, in their infinite wisdom and staggering lack of self-awareness, had built themselves quite the trophy case. Station Omega-7 floated through the void like a grotesque Christmas ornament. All crystalline spires and gleaming metal corridors designed to house what they so charmingly called the collection. Because nothing says advanced civilization quite like turning sentient beings into living museum exhibits. Lord Grex adjusted his ceremonial breathing apparatus, a ridiculous contraption that made him sound like a deflating balloon with delusions of grandeur, as he reviewed his morning reports. The hegemony's finest xenobiologist, or so his credentials claimed, though one might question the academic rigor of any institution that handed out degrees for advanced species subjugation with a minor in condescending documentation. Specimen 77-749 Terra continues to display typical behavioral patterns, he dictated his floating recorder, a device that possessed more personality than its user. The human female remains docile, consuming provided nutrition packets without resistance. Physical conditioning appears stable, though the species' tendency toward emotional instability requires constant monitoring. Oh, Grex. Sweet oblivious Grex. If only he possessed even a fraction of the observational skills he claimed on his resume. The collection sprawled across 17 levels, each dedicated to a different category of conquered species. Level 9 housed what the hegemony termed primitive bipeds, a classification that revealed more about their own limitations than those of their captive. Here, behind walls of what the promotional materials called enhanced transparency barriers, but what everyone else recognized as really expensive cages, lived representatives of dozens of worlds the hegemony had graciously liberated from the burden of self-governance. The human-occupied Cell 7749, a space designed with all the aesthetic sensibility of a medical examination room crossed with a zoo enclosure. 10 years she had called this particular corner of cosmic purgatory home, though home implied a choice in the matter that she distinctly lacked. The designers had attempted to recreate what their extensive research, 3 whole hours on the Galactic Information Network, suggested was a typical human. The result resembled what might happen if aliens tried to furnish an apartment based solely on furniture store advertisements and fever dreams. She sat on the edge of her regulation sleeping platform, a piece of furniture that achieved the remarkable feat of being both too soft and too hard simultaneously. Her daily routine had become as predictable as Grex's morning pomposity. Wake and consume nutritional paste that tasted like disappointment seasoned with artificial hope. Engage in prescribed exercise periods, while being observed by creatures who wouldn't recognize intelligence if it filed a formal complaint with their supervisory board. The other specimens regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and pity. The Xilarian in the adjacent cell, a being that resembled a cross between a praying mantis and a philosophy professor, had long since given up any pretense of maintaining his pre-capture dignity. The Vorthan pack leader 2 cells down spent his days howling existential poetry that translated roughly to "Why did we invent space travel if this is where it leads?" But the human, she watched. She listened. She learned. The hegemony's anthropological assessments read like comedy gold, if one appreciated the humor in spectacular scientific incompetence. According to their files, humans were moderately intelligent tool users with limited problem-solving capabilities and a marked tendency toward emotional decision-making. They'd classified her species somewhere between trainable pets and decorative houseplants, which explained why they treated her with the same careful attention one might give an exotic fern. Grex particularly enjoyed his weekly observation sessions, during which he would stand before her cage and deliver lectures about human psychology to his junior staff. Note the subject's passive acceptance of her circumstances, he would wheeze through his breathing apparatus. Humans lack the cognitive flexibility for long-term strategic thinking. They exist primarily in the moment, driven by immediate needs and primitive emotional responses. If the human found these assessments amusing, she showed no sign of. She had perfected an expression of vacant compliance that would have made a customer service representative weep with recognition. Her eyes held just the right amount of defeated acceptance, her posture suggesting a spirit thoroughly broken by years of captivity. The junior staff nodded along with Grex's pronouncements. Their own understanding of human nature derived entirely from his increasingly creative interpretations of perfectly normal behavior. When she exercised, they noted her repetitive, compulsive movement. When she ate slowly, they documented her primitive feeding rituals. When she stared at the walls, They recorded evidence of mental deterioration consistent with captivity adaptation syndrome. None of them noticed how her exercise routines had gradually evolved into something resembling combat conditioning. None of them questioned why she had requested access to the station's educational databases for mental stimulation. None of them wondered why she seemed so interested in the maintenance schedules that scrolled past her viewing portal. The hegemony's arrogance had always been their defining characteristic, but it reached truly artistic heights in their treatment of lesser species. They had conquered 17 star systems with the casual efficiency of someone rearranging furniture, and their success had bred the kind of cosmic superiority complex that would make a black hole seem humble by comparison. Their collection represented the pinnacle of their cultural achievement, a living library of conquered worlds, each species carefully preserved, like pressed flowers between the pages of galactic history. Visitors from across the hegemony's territories came to marvel at these exotic creatures, to feel that warm glow of civilizational superiority that came from observing the tamed remnants of once proud civilization. The educational tours were particularly popular among hegemony youth, who would press their various sensory organs against the barriers and marvel at these primitive beings who had once thought themselves masters of their own destiny. The irony, of course, was completely lost on them. But irony, like justice, has a way of making itself known when least expected. The human continued her daily routine, day after day, year after year. She ate her paste. She performed her exercises. She submitted to their tests with the resigned cooperation of someone who had accepted her fate. She had become the perfect specimen, broken, compliant, and utterly harmless. At least that's what they wrote in their reports. The truth, as truth often does, wore a rather different face than the official version. While Grex pontificated about human limitations and his staff dutifully recorded their observations of primitive behavior, Specimen 7749 Terra was conducting her own research project, one that would have impressed even the hegemony's most accomplished strategists, had they possessed the wit to recognize brilliance when it was performing for their benefit. 10 years is a long time to watch, listen and learn, long enough to understand not just the language, but the culture, long enough to identify not just the technology, but its weaknesses, long enough to recognize that the greatest cage isn't made of energy barriers or steel walls, but of assumptions. And assumptions, as any good strategist knows, make excellent foundations for a house of cards. The morning of day 36053 of her captivity began like any other, with Grex's wheezing pronouncements about the day's observation schedule, and the continuing docility of their prized human specimen. The irony was so thick you could have used it to armor a battle cruiser. If only they had realized that sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one that's learned to look like prey. The beautiful thing about being underestimated is that nobody bothers to look too closely at your actual activity. While Grex and his merry band of xenobiological disasters were busy congratulating themselves on their brilliant human containment protocols, their prize specimen was conducting what could generously be called the most elaborate psychological warfare campaign in galactic history. It had started with the cleaning drones. The hegemony, in their typical fashion, had automated everything possible to minimize contact between superior beings and their collected specimen. Maintenance was handled by a fleet of artificial intelligences, with all the personality of particularly boring toasters. These drones possessed just enough cognitive capacity to perform their duties, and just little enough to question anything that fell outside their programming parameters. The human had discovered this limitation quite by accident during her second year of captivity. A cleaning drone had malfunctioned while sanitizing her cell, repeatedly bumping into the same wall with the determined stupidity of a bureaucrat following regulation. She had watched this mechanical comedy for several minutes before realizing something delightful. The drone's behavioral patterns were entirely predictable, and its error correction protocols were pathetically inadequate. From there it became a hobby, then a science, then something approaching an art form. By year 4 she could predict which drone would service her area on any given day. By year 6, she had learned to mimic their maintenance signals using nothing more than careful hand movements and strategic positioning of her meager possession. By year 8, she was essentially conducting an orchestra of mechanical servants, who had no idea they were being played like the galaxy's most expensive kazoo ensemble. The truly magnificent part was how she had weaponized their own xenophobia against. The hegemony staff avoided direct contact with specimens whenever possible. Apparently, primitive species carried primitive germs that might contaminate their superior immune system. This convenient paranoia meant that most communication happened through automated systems. And automated systems, as any halfway competent engineer knows, are only as smart as their dumbest programmer. She had requested access to educational materials during her third year, citing intellectual stimulation needs with just the right note of desperate pleading. Grex had approved this with the magnanimous air of someone granting a particularly clever pet a new toy. The educational database they provided was heavily sanitized, of course, containing only appropriate information about galactic history, basic sciences, and cultural studies. What they hadn't considered was that their definition of harmless information included detailed technical manuals, station schematics filed under educational architecture, and maintenance protocols disguised as systems operation theory. Apparently nobody had thought to ask whether teaching a captive how their prison worked might present certain strategic disadvantages. The Bravanian Cell 7751 had been the first to notice the change. These beings possessed a form of empathic communication that the hegemony scientists had dismissed as primitive emotional leakage. What it actually represented was a sophisticated form of nonverbal intelligence sharing, but asking the hegemony to recognize nuanced communication would be like asking a brick to appreciate poetry. Through careful positioning during exercise periods and strategic use of the Bravani's empathic abilities, the human had established contact with 17 different species across 3 levels of the collection. Each species brought their own unique capabilities to what was gradually becoming the galaxy's most diverse resistance network. The Felloids contributed their natural ability to interface with electronic systems. The Urathi offered their perfect memory and pattern recognition skill. The Dolmec pack provided muscle and an intimate understanding of structural engineering. Even the seemingly helpless Wispin had proven valuable. Their natural invisibility to most scanning equipment made them perfect messengers. All of this coordination happened under the oblivious noses of their captors, who continued to file reports about the declining social interaction among their specimens. They interpreted the growing quiet as evidence of successful conditioning, never suspecting that silence can be the loudest form of communication when used correctly. Grex had recently published a paper titled Successful Long-Term Containment Strategies for Aggressive Species, which was currently being distributed throughout hegemony space as a model for future collection efforts. The abstract began with the rather confident assertion that proper psychological conditioning can render even the most rebellious species into docile research subjects within a standard decade of captivity. The timing was exquisite. On the morning that marked exactly 10 years since her arrival, the human sat in her cell performing what appeared to be her usual meditation routine. The cameras recorded her peaceful, contemplative state for the daily behavioral assessment. Her breathing was steady, her posture relaxed, her expression serene. What the cameras couldn't detect was the nearly imperceptible pattern of finger movements she was using to communicate final instructions to her network. What the sensors couldn't measure was the anticipation crackling through the collection, like static electricity before a storm. What Grex couldn't comprehend, as he prepared for another day of scientific observation, was that his perfect specimen had just given the signal that would turn his orderly little zoo into the galaxy's most expensive educational experience. The art of misdirection requires patience, observation, and a deep understanding of your audience's blind spots. After 10 years of study, the human had achieved something approaching a doctoral degree in hegemony stupidity. Class was about to begin. The first sign that something had gone catastrophically wrong with the hegemony's perfect specimen containment system came at precisely 13:47 station time, when the energy barrier to cell 7749 flickered and died with all the ceremony of a burnt-out light bulb. Grex, who happened to be conducting one of his insufferably pompous tours for visiting dignitaries at that exact moment, stared at the deactivated barrier with the expression of someone watching their worldview collapse in real time. His breathing apparatus wheezed frantically as his brain attempted to process an impossibility. Their most docile specimen was standing calmly beside her open cell door, wearing what could only be described as a smile, not the vacant, grateful smile of a well-trained pet. The smile of someone who had just revealed the punchline to a 10-year joke. "Fascinating," she said, her voice carrying an edge that hadn't existed in any of their recorded observations. "Your containment protocols assume that intelligence correlates with technology level." Classic hegemony thinking. The visiting dignitaries, a collection of pompous officials whose combined IQ barely qualified them to operate a doorknob, began making the sort of alarmed, chittering noises that generally preceded bureaucratic panic. Grex, meanwhile, was frantically activating emergency protocols with the desperate efficiency of someone realizing that their career was about to become a cautionary tale. What happened next would later be studied in military academies across 17 systems as a masterclass in psychological warfare, though none of the textbooks would manage to capture the sheer audacity of the execution. The human didn't run. Running would have been the obvious choice, the expected choice, the choice that would have triggered every security protocol the hegemony possessed. Instead, she walked, casually, like someone taking a leisurely stroll through a park they happen to own. The security systems designed to respond to escape attempts found themselves confounded by what appeared to be a casual tour of the facilities. Their algorithms had been programmed to detect fleeing, fighting, or hiding, not sights. The humans' relaxed pace and apparent lack of urgency created a cognitive dissonance in the automated defenses that was almost beautiful to observe. As alarms began wailing with the musical sophistication of a dying walrus, something remarkable happened throughout the collection. The other specimens, creatures who had spent years perfecting their own performances of defeated submission, began dropping their masks with synchronized precision. The Bravani's empathic network erupted into coordinated action. The Feloids interfaced directly with security systems, turning the station's own defensive measures against their operators. The Urathi began reciting perfect reproductions of override codes they had memorized from overheard maintenance communication. The Dolmec pack started systematically dismantling structural supports with the methodical enthusiasm of professional demolition experts. Even the Wispin, bless their translucent hearts, began appearing and disappearing throughout the station, creating the sort of widespread paranoia that makes rational decision-making impossible. The hegemony staff responded with all the tactical brilliance one might expect from beings who had spent their careers studying caged animals. They ran in circles, shouted contradictory orders, and generally provided the sort of entertainment that made the entire uprising feel less like a prison break and more like an impromptu comedy festival. Grex found himself face to face with his prize specimen in the station's central observation deck, surrounded by the chaos of his collapsing authority. His breathing apparatus had reached levels of agitation that suggested imminent mechanical failure. "This is impossible," he wheezed, consulting his datapad as if it might contain an explanation for how his perfectly controlled environment had transformed into a circus of liberated specimens. Humans lack the cognitive capacity for complex planning. Our psychological profiles clearly indicate. Your psychological profiles. The human interrupted with the sort of gentle patience typically reserved for explaining basic concepts to particularly slow children, were based on observing prisoners who were pretending to be broke. "You've been studying a performance for 10 years, and mistaking it for reality." She gestured toward the chaos surrounding them, where former specimens were dismantling security systems with the efficient cooperation of a well-rehearsed orchestra. "Every species you've cataloged as primitive or limited has been watching, learning and planning. We've had nothing but time to study your weaknesses." The beautiful irony was that the hegemony had created the perfect conditions for their own downfall. By isolating representatives from multiple intelligent species in a single location, they had inadvertently established the galaxy's most diverse think tank. By providing educational materials and technical access, they had armed their captives with knowledge. By assuming superiority, they had blinded themselves to the intelligence of those they had underestimated. Grex's datapad slipped from his trembling appendages as the full scope of the situation became clear. This wasn't just an escape, it was a systematic dismantling of everything the hegemony thought they knew about the species they had conquered. The human picked up his fallen device and examined it with casual interest. 10 years, she mused, scrolling through his observation report. 10 years of documentation proving that you understand absolutely nothing about any of us. Behind her, the collection burned, not with fire but with the brilliant light of intelligence finally unleashed. The aftermath of what historians would diplomatically term the collection incident unfolded with all the graceful chaos of a supernova in a tea shop. Grex found himself in the uniquely uncomfortable position of explaining to his superiors how 17 different species had simultaneously achieved perfect coordination while under his supposedly flawless supervision. His report, filed 3 days after the breakout, read like a fever dream written by someone experiencing a very public nervous breakdown. The human, meanwhile, had vanished into the galactic underground with the practiced ease of someone who had spent a decade planning her next career move. She left behind a station full of liberated specimens, a traumatized warden, and a collection of security recordings that would become required viewing in insurgency training programs across the galaxy. But here's where the story becomes truly delicious. The hegemony's attempts at damage control. Their first instinct, naturally, was to classify the entire incident and pretend it had never happened. Nothing says advanced civilization quite like stuffing embarrassing failures into the cosmic equivalent of a filing cabinet and hoping nobody noticed. They issued carefully worded statements about temporary technical difficulties and routine specimen relocation procedures. Unfortunately for them, news of this magnitude possesses a certain gravitational pull. Information wants to be free. And when that information involves the spectacular humiliation of galactic overlords, it develops an almost aggressive enthusiasm for spreading itself across communication networks. The story leaked within a week. What emerged wasn't just news, it was mythology in the making. Each species that heard the tale filtered it through their own cultural lens, creating a spectacular game of cosmic telephone that transformed a prison break into something approaching religious significance. The Corvellian Empire, perpetual rivals of the hegemony, turned it into an epic poem celebrating the triumph of wisdom over brute force. Their version featured elaborate metaphors about the patient hunter who becomes the prey's nightmare, and included 17 stanzas about the strategic applications of apparent submission. The Corvellians, being natural dramatists, may have embellished certain details in their telling. The humans single-handedly destroyed 3 battle cruisers and gave a 2-hour philosophical speech about the nature of freedom. But poetry has never been particularly concerned with factual accuracy. The Feloid resistance networks adopted it as a technical manual disguised as folklore. Their version focused on the systematic exploitation of automated systems and the brilliant use of the enemy's own infrastructure against them. They distributed detailed analyses of the human's methodology, turning her techniques into a curriculum for aspiring revolutionaries. The Feloids, being natural engineers, couldn't help but improve upon the story with additional technical specifications and efficiency rating. The Bravani transformed it into a spiritual parable about the power of patient observation and the illusion of powerlessness. Their empathic interpretation emphasized the decade of mental discipline required to maintain such a perfect deception while building a multi-species alliance. The Bravani version was notably light on action sequences, but heavy on psychological insight, which made it popular among species who appreciated subtlety over explosion. The Dolmec, being practical sorts, turned it into a straightforward tactical guide with step-by-step instructions for infiltrating enemy facilities. Their version included detailed blueprints, suggested improvement modifications, and a rather comprehensive critique of hegemony's security protocol. The Dolmec approach to storytelling could charitably be described as romantic as a maintenance manual, but it was undeniably useful. Each retelling spawned new variations, and each variation spawned new interpretation. The story spread through trade routes, diplomatic channels, and underground networks, with the relentless efficiency of a particularly ambitious virus. Within 6 months, versions were being told in languages the hegemony didn't even know existed. The really beautiful part was watching the hegemony's attempts to control the narrative. They issued counter-reports, claiming the human had been a willing participant in research programs. They suggested the breakout had been staged for educational purposes. They even attempted to argue that the whole thing had been a successful test of their security systems. Nobody believed them. The hegemony's credibility, already somewhat questionable among species who remembered what independence felt like, crumbled faster than their containment protocol. Their reputation as unstoppable conquerors became a galactic punchline, Recruitment for their military forces dropped precipitously as potential allies suddenly discovered pressing engagements elsewhere in the galaxy. More importantly, their collection program was permanently suspended. Not officially, of course, the hegemony never admitted mistakes that publicly, but funding was quietly redirected, personnel were reassigned to other priorities, and the remaining facilities were gradually converted into what the bureaucrats euphemistically called cultural exchange centers. The human herself became something of a ghost story among hegemony forces. Rumors placed her simultaneously on 17 different worlds, leading resistance movements, toppling governments, and generally being the sort of persistent nightmare that keeps imperial administrators awake at night. The truth was probably far more mundane. She had likely settled somewhere quiet to enjoy her freedom. But truth has never been as useful as mythology when it comes to inspiring terror in oppressors. Grex, poor Grex, found himself reassigned to a position in hegemony internal communications, where his primary responsibility involved filing reports. His expertise in xenobiology was deemed no longer relevant to current operational needs, which was hegemony speak for you screwed up so spectacularly that we're demoting you to a job that even our stupidest relatives wouldn't want. The final delicious irony came 2 years later, when the hegemony quietly discontinued their specimen collection programs entirely. The official reasons cited shifting research priorities and evolving diplomatic consideration. The unofficial reason was that nobody wanted to be the next administrator to discover that their perfectly controlled subjects had been running a graduate-level course in revolutionary warfare right under their noses. The greatest scientific minds in hegemony space had spent a decade studying what they believed was a broken, primitive creature. What they had actually been observing was a masterclass in strategic deception, psychological manipulation, and the fine art of turning your captors' assumptions into weapons. The collection still exists, though it now houses volunteers and operates under what the hegemony carefully terms mutually beneficial research agreement. The irony of their former prison becoming a legitimate scientific institution was not lost on anyone except, presumably, the hegemony themselves. And somewhere in the galaxy, on some quiet world with reasonable weather and decent food, a former prisoner is probably enjoying a peaceful retirement, occasionally chuckling at the news reports about mysterious resistance movements that bear a suspicious resemblance to the techniques she spent 10 years perfecting. The hegemony learned a valuable lesson from their experience. Never underestimate a species based on their apparent limitation. Unfortunately, being the hegemony, they learned this lesson approximately 10 years too late to do them any good. As one particularly astute Corvellian philosopher observed in his analysis of the incident, the most dangerous cage is the one built from your enemy's expectation. The former specimen 7049 Terra had simply refused to stay in hers.